Now that we have a better understanding of epistemology and the epistemological contexts for these theories, let's dive into behaviorism. As I said, behaviorism used to be very, very popular. It isn't as popular as it used to be, but it has been extremely influential in schooling practice, and we still can see elements of this in a lot of our classroom practices and evaluation schemes. Even in healthcare, the emphasis that we have on evidence-based practice is also very much influenced by behaviorism. So what is behaviorism? Well, behaviorism is a learning theory that comes from psychology, and it understands learning as being about change in performance or behavior. And it's concerned with teacher and student behaviors that are objectively observable and measurable using a stimulus-response framework. So it understands learning as having been accomplished when an appropriate response is demonstrated following a specific environmental stimulus. Now, what do I mean by stimulus? Well, to understand that, we need to get a little more theoretical again and talk about some specific theorists and what they were all about. And for anyone who's taken an intro to psych class, these names will probably be fairly familiar. So Pavlov is a big one. You've probably heard his name before. He was a Russian physiologist who, in, I believe, the 1890s, was studying digestion and the role of saliva in dogs. And in his research, he noticed that the dogs were starting to salivate before they actually got their food, such as when they heard a click from the food dispenser or even if they saw one of the animal handlers. And then he ended up doing some more experiments with the dogs, which eventually came to be known as classical conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning. And in these experiments, he'd ring a bell right before feeding the dogs. And over time, the dogs started to associate the bell with being fed, so they would be salivating before the food was even brought to them. So here he called food an unconditioned stimulus, and salivating was an unconditioned response because food naturally triggered this response in the dogs. The stimulus that was then introduced, in case of bell, was initially a neutral stimulus, but over time it became a conditioned stimulus because the dogs associated it with food over time. And then salivating from the sound of the bell became a conditioned stimulus. So a more modern day equivalent would be my dog Foxy and going through drive-thrus. So pre-pandemic Foxy didn't know what a drive-thru was. It was very much a neutral stimulus. But now when we go through one and she sees the menu board, she now associates that with food. So as soon as she sees one of those menu boards, she will start drooling and whining, even if we're just going to Starbucks to pick up a coffee, because we have unintentionally classically conditioned her to associate the menu boards with food, and therefore she drools. And in the 1920s, this theory was applied to humans by psychologist John B. Watson in his experiments on little Albert, where he was trying to condition the baby to become afraid of a white rat. And I'll insert a clip here so you can see what he did.
Albert is also unafraid when he encounters a white rat for the first time in his life. But then Watson shows Albert the rat accompanied by a loud clanging noise. One of the few things that upsets little Albert. And he does it again. And does it again. Eventually, Albert learns to fear not just the rat, but all furry things, even without the loud noise. In Watson's mind, the little Albert experiment is a success because it proves that fears are learned, not inherited.
And this sort of experiment, folks, is one of many reasons why we now have research ethics boards. This sort of experiment would not be approved now. Operant conditioning is another theory you may hear about, and it's different because in this one we're talking about voluntary behavior changes, unlike classical conditioning where the dog salivating wasn't a voluntary change. And this school of thought comes from B.F. Skinner in the 1950s, 1960s, who was an American psychologist. And this theory is very much oriented around reinforcement and punishment. So reinforcement was something that made the individual more likely to repeat a behavior, and then a punishment makes it less likely. And these can be positive, so adding a stimulus, or negative, which is the removal of a stimulus. So positive and negative here is in respects to whether a stimulus has been introduced rather than it being a matter of good or bad. So in our Big Bang Theory video we watched as a Motivation Monday this week, it's a great example of operant conditioning. So Sheldon offering Penny chocolates is an example of positive reinforcement. He's adding a stimulus, in this case chocolate, to get her to repeat a behavior that he likes. And at the end where he sprays his roommate Leonard in the face with water, it's a positive punishment. not because it's positive for Leonard, but because he's adding in a stimulant, in this case water to the face, to deter Leonard from a behavior. Another example of positive versus negative punishments for my parents in the class would be a positive punishment would be giving your kids extra chores, and a negative punishment would be taking away a privilege like their PlayStation. So positive or negative reinforcements tend to encourage the repetition of behaviors, whereas punishments, whether positive or negative, tends to generate an aversion or a suppression of a behavior. Let's take a moment to reflect here on behaviorism. Can you think of any examples where you've experienced this as a learner, as a teacher, or even as your own experience as a parent or being someone's child? I will say you have already experienced behaviorism in 52-53. So the marks I gave out for our survey and introductions were an example of operant conditioning applied to teaching. So here I was using positive reinforcement, giving everyone 1% each for doing the desired behavior, which was filling out the survey and introducing yourself. Now, one of our focused readings that you had the option of reading this week talked about learning theories in gaming. Specifically, for this week, I assigned the portions that were on behaviorism and cognitivism. And I thought this was a pretty interesting chapter and a very unique take on learning theories. And many of you indicated in our survey and introductions that you're into gaming. So I thought this is an interesting lens to kind of look at these theories through. So in the article, they talk about behaviorism in gaming. And one of the examples they give here is learning how to play a game as being an example of behaviorism. So how game rules and play structures are often learned through a process of trial and error. And video games also have objectives, punishment and reward mechanisms, and these should be repeated, consistent, fair, and valuable to the player. Now, there can also be learning through a game, but this often requires the player to go beyond a behaviorist approach. So a behaviorist approach to gaming works better for games that don't have a complex narrative. So more traditional platform or casual games like arcade games, even some physical enactment games like shooters or racing games. And the reading gives the example of Super Mario, which was one of the few games I got to play as a kid because we weren't allowed gaming systems. So for this one, it very much uses the behaviorist approach. So you get rewards when you walk through coins. And there's also learning going on when you learn things like how when you throw the Koopa or the turtle shell at the treasure chest, you get coins. The latter example here with the Koopa shells has more of an exploratory component that requires a degree of trial and error by the player. And these both positively reinforce players' behavior because they may, say, change their path so they walk through more coins. There's also negative punishments when health points and eventually lives are taken away, say if you run into the piranha plant. So the player learns to avoid these dangers and they will do things like seek out the turtle shells. So when can we apply behaviorism? Well, behaviorism tends to work well when the goal of learning involves things like having our learners recall facts, defining and illustrating concepts, applying explanations, or when we want them to automatically perform some sort of a specific procedure. Behaviorism doesn't tend to work as well when we're dealing with learning goals that look more at high-level skills, such as those that require more depth in the processing, so language development, problem solving, inference generating, and critical thinking. And this is one of the reasons why I don't tend to use behaviorism, except for in that first module here, because this is a sort of learning that I tend to deal with more. So it's one of the reasons why I don't tend to use behaviorism. Now, as we're discussing some of these areas, when it works to apply this or not, some of you may be reminded of Bloom's taxonomy. I was certainly seeing some links there as I was reading through the articles. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Bloom's taxonomy, or the taxonomy of educational objectives, as is its full name, this is a framework for classifying statements or learning objectives of what we expect or intend our learners to learn as a result of our instruction. So there's two parts to writing our learning objectives using this particular taxonomy. There's the noun or the content and a verb. And these both represent two different dimensions. The knowledge dimension, which includes factual, conceptual, procedural, and metacognitive knowledge, and the cognitive process dimension. And I think the latter is what most people probably most associate with Bloom's taxonomy, because it's the pyramid diagram that comes up when you Google search Bloom's taxonomy. So here there are 6 categories: remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. And these go from more simple to more complex or more abstract. So many of the examples that Ertmer and Newby share for when behaviorism is appropriate, they do tend to be on the lower end of this pyramid. And in fact, the whole attempt to define learning objectives like this actually does also have its roots in behaviorism. And a concern that has been raised here, especially in higher education, is if having learning outcome definitions that are so rooted in behaviorism is even appropriate for higher education. And for those of you who maybe behaviorism isn't really resonating with, that's not to say don't have clearly defined objectives or learning outcomes. These can be incredibly useful for students, but we do want to consider the theoretical underpinning of our objectives. So consider the verbs you're selecting when you're writing your learning objectives, and what learning theory is underpinning your decision here, and what implications does this have for learning? For example, are your verbs coming from the lower end of Bloom's taxonomy and more influenced by behaviorism, rather than, say, a higher level on the pyramid, if you're even using the pyramid in planning your teaching? And then also being mindful that the basis of Bloom's taxonomy is behaviorism. And this sort of thing is why working on your philosophy of teaching can be a very useful and very practical exercise for your teaching practice. As you probably have guessed from me going through this, there are some limitations and critiques of behaviorism. A big one is that it doesn't account for how conceptual change occurs because it's really looking at how behaviors have changed. So it's very focused on external stimuli. And with behaviorism being so focused on consequences, namely rewards / reinforcement and punishment, it really ignores the role of language and meaning in learning. And a related critique here is that the focus on reinforcements really emphasizes this role of extrinsic motivation. However, as we discussed in adult learning, there is also a big role for intrinsic motivation in our learners. And this is another reason why I don't use a lot of behaviorism. While I do believe there's absolutely a role for extrinsic motivation in learning, I find that intrinsic motivation is more powerful with my adult learners. And in my experience, kind of capitalizing on this tends to lead for deeper learning and better engagement in my courses. An additional critique is that behaviorism is very focused on the individual, and it doesn't account for the role of collaboration in learning. And that's not to say we can't just look at the individual learner when we're talking about teaching and learning, but I think we also need to acknowledge that there is a broader social context here.